The child had not opened his eyes in 11 days. Viktor Draven stood at the window of the manor's east wing, watching the November fog roll across the hills like mourners approaching a funeral. The mist moved with deliberate slowness, swallowing trees and fences and forgotten garden statuary, reducing the world to shades of gray that matched the hollowness in his ancient heart. Behind him, the bedroom lay in perpetual twilight, heavy velvet drapes drawn against a world that had ceased to matter. The only light came from a single candelabra on the nightstand, its flames casting trembling shadows across the walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of silence, of solitude, of a king who had outlived everyone he ever loved. Everyone except this boy. Sebastian was 7 years old, 7 years that Viktor had counted in heartbeats rather than centuries, in scraped knees and midnight stories rather than wars and kingdoms fallen. The boy lay motionless beneath silk sheets the color of storm clouds, his pale face luminous in the candlelight, his dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. His chest rose and fell with the shallow rhythm of something not quite sleep, not quite death. Some terrible liminal space between the two that no physician, no healer, no ancient remedy had been able to penetrate. 100 doctors. Viktor had counted them as they came and went, these men and women of modern medicine and forgotten arts. Cardiologists from Vienna who spoke of irregular rhythms and mysterious arrhythmias. Neurologists from Boston who ordered scans that showed nothing wrong, nothing abnormal, nothing that could explain why a child simply stopped engaging with the world. Herbalists who spoke in whispers of remedies older than written language, brewing bitter teas from roots that grew only in moonlight. Shamans who burned sage and chanted in tongues that predated empires, their ancient eyes growing troubled when their spirits returned with no answers. And then there were the others, the blood specialists who understood the particular biology of their kind. Vampire physicians who served the ancient courts in shadows, who knew the secrets of immortal flesh and undying hearts. They had examined Sebastian with instruments that had no names in human languages, had tested his blood against samples from 1,000 years of medical knowledge. They too had left bewildered, frightened, apologetic. Each had examined the boy. Each had run their tests, consulted their texts, performed their rituals. Each had left with the same expression: defeat hidden beneath professional composure. Fear flickering in eyes that had seen much but understood nothing of this. The illness defied categorization. Sebastian's vital signs were stable yet meaningless. His blood showed no infection, no poison, no trace of the curses that plagued their kind. He simply faded. Day by day, hour by hour, the light behind his closed eyes grew dimmer, as if something was slowly drinking the essence of his soul. Viktor pressed his forehead against the cold glass, feeling the chill seep through flesh that no longer registered temperature as humans did. 347 years he had walked this earth. He had watched civilizations crumble and rise from the ashes. He had survived the great purges, when humans hunted his kind with fire and silver, when he had hidden in crypts beneath burning churches and listened to the screams of his brothers and sisters above. He had endured the loneliness of decades spent underground, waiting for the persecution to end, marking time by the growth of moss on ancient stone. He had buried lovers whose faces he could still recall in perfect detail, their smiles, their voices, the particular way they moved through rooms. He had buried friends who had been closer than blood. He had buried enemies who had become something like family over the centuries, bound together by the shared burden of immortality. He had thought himself beyond pain, beyond the reach of grief's cruel fingers, hardened by centuries into something that could endure anything. He had been wrong. The boy's mother had been mortal. Ilara, a name that still moved through Viktor like music, like mourning, like the memory of warmth when one has been cold for far too long. She had found him in Budapest, bleeding in an alley after a confrontation with hunters, and she had done the unthinkable. She had helped him. Not because she didn't know what he was. She had known. The wound, the paleness of his skin, the inhuman grace that clung to him even in his weakened state. She had known. She had simply chosen compassion over fear, had dressed his wounds with steady hands, and spoken to him in a voice that held no judgment, only gentle concern. They had 3 years together. 3 years of stolen moments, of a love that defied the natural order and every law of their respective kinds. When she discovered she was pregnant, the vampire elders had called it impossible. Such unions simply did not produce offspring, had never produced offspring in the millennia of vampire history. When Sebastian was born, small, perfect, impossibly alive, they had called it miraculous, unprecedented, perhaps prophetic. When Ilara died from complications that no immortal healing could prevent, Viktor had called it the end of everything worth living for. Except, it wasn't. Because Sebastian had her eyes, warm amber flecked with gold, mortal eyes in an immortal's face. He had her laugh, bright and unexpected in the echoing halls of the manor, a sound that made ancient portraits seem to soften their stern gazes. He had her capacity for wonder, for joy, for seeing beauty in things Viktor had long since stopped noticing. The way dust motes danced in moonlight, the intricate patterns of frost on winter windows, the small miracles of ordinary existence. And now, Viktor was losing him too. He turned from the window and crossed to the bed, lowering himself into the chair he had occupied for 11 days. 11 days without feeding, without rest, without hope. His body had begun to weaken. Even immortals needed sustenance, but he could not bring himself to leave, could not bear the thought of Sebastian waking to an empty room, reaching for a hand that wasn't there. He took Sebastian's small hand in his own, so fragile, so impossibly warm despite everything, and held it as he had held his son's hand 1,000 times before. Reading stories, walking through moonlit gardens, teaching him the constellations that had guided Viktor through centuries of wandering. "I don't know what to do," Viktor whispered, his voice cracking on words he had never spoken aloud. The vampire king, the ancient one, the terror of 100 battlefields, reduced to this: a father, helpless, watching his child slip away. "I have tried everything. I have exhausted every possibility, and still you fade from me, and I cannot—" His voice broke. "I cannot follow where you are going." The candles flickered, the fog pressed against the windows like curious ghosts, like the spirits of all those Viktor had lost over the centuries, gathering to witness this final grief. And somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight. The hour when Viktor's world had always felt most alive, and now felt only like a countdown to an end he could not bear to imagine. His steward, Marcus, appeared in the doorway. A vampire nearly as old as Viktor, though without the weight of kingship on his shoulders. His face, usually impassive as carved stone, held something that looked almost like uncertainty. "My lord," he said softly, "there is someone at the gate. Send them away. My lord, she says she had a dream about the boy. She says she knows what ails him." Viktor didn't look up. 100 doctors have failed, 100 experts with centuries of knowledge between them. What could one more possibly offer? "She is not a doctor, my lord." Marcus hesitated, and in that hesitation Viktor heard something he had not heard from his steward in 200 years. Uncertainty that bordered on wonder. "She is a waitress from the diner in town. She walked 3 miles through the fog to reach us, with nothing but a coat over her work uniform. She stood at our gates and refused to leave until I agreed to deliver her message." Viktor finally raised his head, something flickering in the depths of his ancient eyes. Not hope. He had abandoned hope days ago, had locked it away in the same part of his heart where he kept his memories of Alara. But curiosity, perhaps, or the desperate recognition that he had nothing left to lose. "Bring her to me." Her name was Clara Santos, and she was still wearing her work uniform when Marcus led her into the manor's great hall, a faded blue dress beneath a threadbare coat that had seen better decades, sensible shoes that had worn thin at the soles, an apron still tied around her waist with the logo of Murphy's, all-night diner embroidered on the pocket in thread that was starting to unravel. Her dark hair was damp from the fog, escaping from a practical braid that suggested a woman who had little time for vanity. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of face that held both exhaustion and resilience in equal measure, brown eyes that had seen hardship, a mouth that still remembered how to smile despite everything life had thrown at it. She should have been afraid. The manor was not subtle in its otherness, the architecture too old, too grand, speaking of centuries when such places were built to intimidate as much as to shelter. The shadows were too deep, pooling in corners that seemed to swallow light entirely. The silence was too complete, the kind of silence that suggested listening rather than emptiness. Marcus moved with the unnatural grace of their kind, fluid and predatory, and Viktor knew his own presence radiated the cold power that had made armies tremble, had sent hunters fleeing into the night rather than face him. Humans who stumbled upon vampire territory usually fled, or screamed, or collapsed into the paralysis of instinctive terror. Their ancestors had learned, in the dark ages before recorded history, that certain predators required absolute stillness, absolute submission, in the desperate hope that they might be overlooked. Clara Santos did none of these things. She walked into the great hall with steady steps that echoed against marble floors, took in the vaulted ceilings and ancient tapestries with mild interest as if viewing a museum exhibit, and stopped at a respectful distance from Viktor's chair. When she spoke, her voice was clear and unafraid, not reckless, not foolish, but possessed of a calm certainty that Viktor had rarely encountered in his long existence. "You're the one they talk about," she said. "The master of the hill manor, the one who never ages, who only comes to town after dark. They say you've lived in this house for longer than anyone can remember. They say your kind once ruled these lands." She tilted her head, studying him with those perceptive brown eyes. "They say you're dangerous. I am. I know." She said it simply, without bravado or false courage. "I'm not here because I think you're safe. I'm here because I had a dream about a little boy who was drowning in darkness, and when I woke up, I couldn't get his face out of my mind. I've been dreaming about him for 3 nights now. The same dream, over and over, this child, reaching through shadows, calling for someone who couldn't hear him. And tonight, the dream showed me this house, this hill, these gates." Viktor rose from his chair, and Clara didn't step back. He was tall, imposing, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the candlelight. His face was carved from centuries of experience, sharp cheekbones, pale skin, eyes the color of winter twilight that held depths no mortal could fathom. Beautiful, in the way that dangerous things often are. Terrible, in the way that grief makes monsters of even the gentlest souls. "Dreams," he said flatly. "You walked 3 miles through fog and darkness because of dreams. I walked 3 miles because that boy is suffering, and I think I know why." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "In my dream, he's not sick, not in any way medicine would recognize. He's lonely. Something in him is searching for something it can't find, and the search is consuming him from the inside out. He's reaching, and there's nothing there to reach back." Viktor went very still. The words struck something deep within him, some truth he had been circling without recognizing, some piece of a puzzle he had been too close to see. "You're half right," he said slowly. "Sebastian is half vampire, half human. A rarity, perhaps the only one of his kind in existence. His mother was mortal. His voice caught. Even after 7 years, the words were sharp-edged, capable of drawing blood. "She died bringing him into this world." Something softened in Clara's face. Not pity. Viktor would have bristled at pity, would have withdrawn behind his ancient walls. This was something else. Understanding, perhaps. The recognition of loss that echoed her own. "I'm sorry," she said. "My mother died when I was young too. Cancer. It took her piece by piece over 2 years. I remember what it felt like afterward, like half of me was missing, like I was reaching for something that wasn't there anymore, like there was a warmth in the world that had gone out and no one else could feel how cold everything had become." "You presume to compare your grief to mine." The words came out colder than Viktor intended, a reflex honed by centuries of keeping the world at a distance. Clara didn't flinch. "Grief isn't a competition. It doesn't matter if you've lived 300 years or 30. Losing someone you love leaves the same hole." She paused. "Can I see him? The boy?" Viktor should have refused. A human in his son's sick room, a stranger with no credentials, no expertise, nothing but dreams and a stubborn certainty in her eyes. It was foolish. It was desperate. It was the act of a man who had run out of rational options and was grasping at whatever remained. He led her up the sweeping staircase, through corridors lined with portraits of faces long forgotten, past doors that hadn't opened in decades. Clara walked beside him in silence, but he could sense her taking everything in, the weight of history that pressed against these walls, the loneliness that permeated every stone, the way the house itself seemed to hold its breath as they passed. "How long have you lived here alone?" she asked as they approached Sebastian's room. "I have servants, Marcus, others." "That's not what I asked." Viktor paused with his hand on the door handle. "Too long," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Long enough to forget what it felt like to have someone ask. Long enough to forget that such questions could be asked with kindness rather than interrogation." He opened the door. Clara stepped into the room and stopped short, her breath catching. Sebastian lay exactly as Viktor had left him, small and still beneath the storm-colored sheets, his face pale and peaceful and terribly, terribly wrong. Children were meant to move, to fidget, to fill rooms with their irrepressible energy. This stillness was a violation of natural law, an offense against everything childhood was supposed to be. "Oh," Clara whispered, and there was grief in that single syllable. Not for herself. For this child she had never met. This boy she had seen only in dreams. "Oh, sweetheart." She crossed to the bed without asking permission, pulled the chair closer, and took Sebastian's hand in hers. Her touch was gentle, careful, the way one might hold something infinitely precious and terrifyingly fragile. Her thumb traced absent circles on his small palm. "In my dream," she said softly, "he's searching for warmth, not physical warmth, something deeper, something he remembers but can't find anymore. Like he's looking for a hand that used to hold his, a voice that used to sing to him." She looked up at Viktor. "When did the illness start?" 3 weeks ago, gradually at first. He complained of being tired. Then he stopped wanting to play, to explore. He slept more and more, retreating from the world in increments, and then he simply didn't wake up." "What happened 3 weeks ago? Anything unusual?" Viktor frowned, searching his memory. "Nothing. A normal week. Lessons with his tutors. Walks in the garden. He asked me about his mother. He does sometimes. And I told him stories about her, about how she used to sing, how she would tell him about the stars, how much she loved him even though they never met properly. I showed him her portrait, played the recordings of her voice that I've preserved." "Stories," Clara repeated. Her thumb continued its gentle circles on Sebastian's palm. "But not presence, not touch, not the actual warmth of a mother's love. His mother is dead. I cannot provide what does not exist." "No," Clara agreed. "You can't give him a Lara. But have you considered that maybe what he needs isn't specifically his mother? Maybe what he needs is just—" She paused, searching for words. "Human warmth, mortal compassion. The thing his vampire side can't provide for his human half. He's half mortal, isn't he? Maybe that half needs something that stories and recordings can't give. Maybe it needs to be held, to be touched, to feel the kind of love that flows through warm hands and beating hearts." Viktor stared at her, the implications of her words settling over him like a revelation. 100 doctors, 100 experts looking for disease, for curse, for poison, and not one of them, not one, had considered the possibility that Sebastian was starving for something that couldn't be measured in blood tests or magical scans. Something that didn't show up on any instrument or in any ancient text. Human love. "You must think me a monster," Viktor said later that night, when Clara had finished her examination of Sebastian. Not the clinical poking and prodding of the doctors, but something gentler. She had simply sat with him, held his hand, hummed soft melodies under her breath. And perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it was desperation coloring Viktor's perception. But he could have sworn the boy's breathing had deepened, grown more peaceful, as if some tension he had been carrying had begun, ever so slightly, to ease. They sat now in the library, a room Viktor had always loved for its sense of contained infinity. Thousands of books rising toward a ceiling lost in shadow, centuries of human thought gathered in leather and paper, the accumulated wisdom of mortal minds that had lived and died and left only their words behind. Clara held a cup of tea between her hands. He had asked Marcus to prepare it. The vampire steward had looked almost comically confused at the request, and she studied Viktor over the rim with those disconcertingly perceptive eyes. "Why would I think that? I am a vampire. I have killed. I have fed on human blood for over 3 centuries. I have done terrible things in the name of survival, in the name of my kind." Viktor spread his hands, elegant hands, capable of gentleness and destruction in equal measure. "I have lived long enough to become every horror story your species tells about mine. The monster under the bed, the shadow in the dark, the creature that drinks life itself. And yet," Clara set down her tea, "you raised a child alone. You called 100 doctors to save him. You let a complete stranger into your home on nothing but hope." She shook her head. "Monsters don't do those things. Monsters don't sit by their children's bedsides for 11 days, refusing to feed because they can't bear to leave. Monsters don't speak of dead wives with voices that break. You don't know the things I've done." "No," she agreed, "but I know the things you're doing now. The past is immutable. You can't change it, can't undo it, can't rewrite who you were. The only thing that matters is who you're choosing to be in this moment. And in this moment, you're a father desperate to save his son. That's not monstrous. That's the most human thing I've ever seen." Viktor laughed, a hollow sound, rusty with disuse. "I haven't been human for a very long time. Maybe not biologically, but humanity isn't just about biology." Clara leaned forward, her voice soft with conviction. "My grandmother used to say that humanity is a choice we make every day, to care about others, to feel compassion, to love even when love is painful. You made that choice when you fell in love with Sebastian's mother. You make it every day you care for him, every story you tell, every night you sit by his bed and hold his hand." Viktor turned to the window, where the fog had begun, to thin, revealing glimpses of a sky thick with stars. Ilara said something similar once. She said I had spent so long pretending to be a monster that I had forgotten I had the choice to be something else, that the mask had become the face, and I needed to remember there was something underneath. She sounds wise. She was remarkable. Viktor's voice softened with memory. I met her in 1847, in a Budapest that doesn't exist anymore. Cobblestone streets and gas lamps, a world still innocent of the horrors the next century would bring. I was wounded, a hunter's silver bullet in my shoulder, and she found me bleeding in an alley behind her father's bakery. Any sensible person would have run, would have called for help, or simply looked the other way. But Ilara... He shook his head. She dragged me inside, dressed my wounds, fed me bread warm from the oven while she worked the silver free with steady hands, and a determination that bordered on absurd. She knew what you were? From the moment she saw me, my eyes, the wound that should have been fatal, the way my flesh was already beginning to knit around the silver. She knew. Viktor almost smiled. I asked her why she helped me. She said that suffering deserves compassion regardless of its source, that a creature in pain is still a creature in pain, whether it walks on 2 legs or 4, whether it lives for decades or centuries. Clara was quiet for a moment. I think I would have liked her. She would have liked you. You have the same quality, this stubborn refusal to see the darkness first. Viktor turned back to face her. I offered her immortality, you know, near the end when she was pregnant and the complications began. I begged her to let me turn her, to preserve her, to keep her with us forever. But she refused. She said immortality would change her, that the thing I loved about her, her capacity for warmth, for human connection, for simple joys, might not survive the transformation. She said she would rather live one mortal lifetime fully than exist for eternity as a shadow of herself. Viktor's voice cracked. She made me promise to raise Sebastian with love, to teach him both sides of his heritage, to never let him forget that his humanity was a gift, not a weakness. And you've done that. I've tried. Viktor sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of centuries. But I am not equipped for this. I can teach him to hunt, to survive, to navigate the politics of vampire courts. I can tell him stories about his mother, show him her portraits, play the recordings of her voice that I've preserved, but I cannot give him what she could have, the warmth of mortal love, the gentle comfort that I have long since lost the capacity to provide. You haven't lost it, Clara said softly. You've just forgotten where to find it. Before Viktor could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway. His face, usually impassive, held something that looked remarkably like hope. My lord, he said. The boy. He moved. He turned his head toward where Miss Santos was sitting, as if he was searching for her. They found Sebastian exactly as Marcus had described, his head turned slightly on the pillow, his face angled toward the empty chair where Clara had sat. It wasn't much. It wasn't waking. But it was the first voluntary movement he had made in 11 days, and Viktor felt something crack open in his chest at the sight of it. Clara returned to her seat immediately, taking Sebastian's hand in hers. Hey, sweetheart, she murmured. I'm here. I'm right here. Viktor watched, feeling like an intruder in his own son's room. The ease of Clara's affection, the naturalness of her warmth. These were things he had observed in Ilara, but never mastered himself. His love for Sebastian was fierce, protective, absolute. But it was also ancient, formal, filtered through centuries of emotional distance. He realized, with a pain that cut deeper than any silver blade, that he had been loving his son the way vampires love, with devotion that endured across ages, but that kept itself contained, controlled, safe. And Sebastian needed more than safety. He needed warmth. I've been thinking, Clara said, not looking away from Sebastian, about what the doctors might have missed. They were all looking for something wrong, a disease, a curse, a biological failure. But what if there's nothing wrong at all? What if Sebastian's body is functioning exactly as it should? How can you say that? He's dying. Is he? Clara looked up at Viktor. Or is he waiting? Waiting for what? The same thing any child waits for when they're lost or afraid or alone. Clara's voice was gentle but certain. Someone to find them, someone to hold them, someone to tell them that everything is going to be okay, not because it's true, but because saying it makes it true. Because love has a power that defies logic, defies death, defies even the boundaries between mortal and immortal. Viktor shook his head. That's not science. That's not medicine. That's faith, Clara said. It's faith. And I know that probably doesn't mean much to someone who's lived long enough to see religions rise and fall like seasons. But faith isn't about gods or doctrines or ancient texts. Faith is about believing in something you can't prove, something you can only feel, like the way you love Sebastian's mother, like the way you love Sebastian now. Viktor opened his mouth to argue, to dismiss, to retreat into the rational detachment that had protected him for 3 centuries. But before he could speak, Sebastian made a sound, a small, soft noise, somewhere between a sigh and a whimper. His eyelids fluttered. Clara leaned closer, squeezing his hand. "That's it, sweetheart. Come back to us. Your papa is here. I'm here. You're safe." Viktor found himself moving without conscious decision, crossing to the other side of the bed, taking Sebastian's other hand. The small fingers were cool in his grip, but not the terrible coldness of death, just the chill of a child who had been too long without warmth. "Sebastian," he said, and his voice broke on the name. "I'm sorry. I've been so focused on finding a cure that I forgot to simply be here, to hold you, to tell you that I love you, not in stories about your mother, but in simple, ordinary moments of presence." He brought the boy's hand to his lips, pressed a kiss against the small knuckles. "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. And I need you to come back to me, because I cannot—" His voice shattered completely. "I cannot do this alone." The room was silent except for the guttering of candles. Outside, the fog had cleared completely, and moonlight streamed through the windows, silvering everything it touched. Viktor thought of all the moonlit nights he had spent alone, all the centuries of solitude, all the walls he had built against a world that had taught him, again and again, that attachment meant loss. And then Sebastian opened his eyes, amber flecked with gold, Ilara's eyes, warm and wondering, looking up at Viktor with a confusion that was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Papa," Sebastian's voice was rough with disuse, barely a whisper. "Papa, I had the strangest dream. I was lost in the dark, and I couldn't find you, and I kept calling, but you couldn't hear me. And then—" his gaze drifted to Clara. "And then there was a lady. She was singing, and her voice was like sunlight, and she showed me the way home." Viktor couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He gathered Sebastian in his arms and held him with all the desperate tenderness he had been too proud or too frightened to show, and the boy clung to him with small, fierce arms and buried his face in Viktor's shoulder. "I missed you, Papa," Sebastian whispered. "I missed you too," Viktor managed, "more than you will ever know." Clara slipped out of the room while Viktor held his son, giving them the privacy of their reunion. She made her way through the silent corridors of the manor, still wearing her faded work uniform, still smelling faintly of coffee and bacon grease from her shift at the diner. It had been, she reflected, possibly the strangest night of her entire life. She found herself in the great hall, standing before a massive fireplace where no fire had burned in what looked like decades. The moonlight cast long shadows across the marble floor, and she thought about all the footsteps these stones must have witnessed. Vampire lords and ladies from ages past, human servants who lived and died while their masters endured, and now a waitress from Murphy's all-night diner, still wearing her sensible shoes. "You have questions?" She turned. Marcus stood in the doorway, his ancient face inscrutable. "More than I can count," Clara admitted. "The boy's illness," Marcus said, moving into the hall with the fluid grace of his kind. "You understood it instinctively. That is not a common gift." "I don't have any gifts. I'm just a waitress who works double shifts and dreams strange dreams." "Are you?" Marcus tilted his head, studying her with eyes that had witnessed empires fall. "I have seen many humans in my long existence, Miss Santos. Most of them would not have walked 3 miles through fog to a vampire's manor on the strength of a dream. Most of them would not have sat beside a strange child and offered comfort as naturally as breathing. Most of them would not have looked at my master, one of the most feared vampires in existence, and seen not a monster, but a grieving father." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the manor was. "What are you saying?" "There are old stories," Marcus said, "about humans born with a particular kind of soul. Healers, they were called, though not in any medical sense. They healed by presence, by compassion, by the simple act of truly seeing the suffering of others and responding with love instead of fear. Such souls are rare, perhaps one in a generation, perhaps fewer. They cannot be trained or manufactured. They simply are." He paused. Sebastian's mother was one such soul. It would seem the universe has sent another. Before Clara could respond, footsteps echoed from the staircase. Viktor appeared, carrying Sebastian in his arms. The boy was awake, his small face still pale, but his eyes bright with the curious wonder that was so achingly normal. "He wanted to see you," Viktor said to Clara. "He insisted, quite forcefully, I might add." Sebastian wiggled in his father's arms. "You're the lady from my dream," he said, his voice still rough but growing stronger. "You sang to me. You showed me the light when everything was dark." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "I just held your hand, sweetheart. That's all." "No." Sebastian shook his head with the absolute certainty of children. "You were warm. Everything else was cold and dark, but you were warm. Like," he frowned, searching for words, "like Mama, in the stories Papa tells. You felt like her." Victor's eyes met Clara's across the great hall. In the moonlight, she could see the centuries of pain in those ancient depths, but she could also see something else, something that looked like hope, something that looked like possibility. "Miss Santos," he said formally, though his voice was warm in a way it hadn't been hours ago, "I find myself in your debt, a debt I have no idea how to repay. You have given me back my son, the only thing in this world I cannot live without." "I didn't heal him," Clara said. "He healed himself. He just needed someone to remind him he wasn't alone in the dark." Nevertheless, Viktor set Sebastian down. The boy immediately crossed to Clara and wrapped his arms around her waist in a hug that nearly knocked her off her feet. "You came when no one else would. You believed when no one else could. That is not nothing." Clara found herself laughing, a slightly hysterical sound, born of exhaustion and wonder and the sheer absurdity of her situation. "I should get back," she said. "My shift at the diner. I'll be missed. Stay." The word came from Sebastian, not Viktor. "Please, just for a little while. Papa tells the best stories, but he's not very good at—" The boy searched for the word. "Hugs. He tries, but he's too cold. And you're warm." Viktor looked like he might protest, might preserve the dignified distance that had protected him for so long. But something in him shifted. Clara could see it happening, like ice beginning to thaw. "Stay," he echoed, and there was no command in his voice, only invitation, only hope. "Please, let me at least offer you breakfast and a proper thank you. And perhaps—" He hesitated. "Perhaps Sebastian could show you the garden. He's been wanting to share it with someone new." Clara looked down at the small face gazing up at her, amber eyes flecked with gold, so full of trust, so hungry for connection, and she thought about the lonely apartment waiting for her in town, the double shifts at the diner, the years she had spent since her mother's death, wondering if this was all life would ever be. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." Dawn was breaking through the windows now, painting the great hall in shades of gold and rose. For the first time in centuries, Viktor did not flinch from the light. He watched it touch his son's hair, watched it warm Clara's tired face, and he felt something ancient and long frozen begin to stir in the depths of his immortal heart. Not heat, exactly. Not the warmth he had lost when he died his mortal death 3 centuries ago, but something close, something like hope. 6 months later, the manor on the hill was no longer silent. Laughter echoed through corridors that had known only whispers for centuries. The gardens, long neglected, bloomed with new plantings, roses that Sebastian tended with careful hands, herbs that Clara used for cooking, moonflowers that opened at dusk and perfumed the air with sweetness. The library's hearth held real flames now, crackling warmly as the 3 of them gathered for stories on cold evenings. Clara had never returned to the diner. Viktor had offered her a position as Sebastian's companion and tutor, a formal arrangement that fooled no one, least of all themselves. She had moved into the East Wing, into rooms that hadn't been occupied since Alara's death, and she had brought with her a warmth that transformed the ancient house into something it had never quite been, a home. Sebastian thrived. The illness had left no lasting mark, and he grew stronger with each passing week. A remarkable child, neither fully vampire nor fully human, but something new, something that carried the best of both worlds within his small body. He called Clara Miss Clara with formal politeness, and Clara when he was excited, and increasingly simply Clara in the soft voice of a child who has found something precious. Viktor watched them from the doorway of the conservatory on this particular evening, Sebastian explaining the life cycle of his moonflowers with the passionate intensity of a 7-year-old scholar, Clara listening with genuine interest and asking questions that made the boy's face light up with delight. The setting sun painted everything gold, and Viktor committed the image to memory with the same care he had once reserved for battles and betrayals. This, he thought, this is what I was afraid of for 3 centuries. This precise moment, this terrible vulnerability, this opening of the heart that makes pain possible, and it was worth it. Every risk, every fear, every possibility of loss, it was worth it for this single instant of peace. "You're brooding." Clara appeared at his side, her arm brushing his. She had learned, over the months, not to be afraid of the coldness of his skin, the ancient weight of his presence. She touched him easily now, a hand on his arm, a bump of her shoulder against his, the casual intimacy of people who have become family. "You always get this look when you're brooding." "I am not brooding. I am reflecting." "Same thing." She smiled, that warm, uncomplicated smile that had saved his son, and, in doing so, had saved something in Viktor he hadn't known still existed. "What are you reflecting on?" Viktor was quiet for a moment, watching Sebastian carefully deadhead a wilting bloom. "I have lived for over 3 centuries, he said finally. "I have seen wonders and horrors beyond human imagination. I have loved and lost and endured in ways I could never adequately describe. And yet—" He turned to look at Clara, at this remarkable ordinary woman who had walked through fog and darkness on nothing but faith. "I think these 6 months have been the happiest of my entire existence." Clara's eyes softened. "Viktor, I am not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I am not proposing or promising or demanding. I know that I am what I am. Immortal, dangerous, a creature from nightmares. I know that you could leave tomorrow, find someone human and whole and simple. I know that Sebastian and I have no right to ask you to stay. But you're asking anyway. I am hoping," Viktor corrected. "For the first time in centuries, I am allowing myself to hope. And that is because of you, Clara. Because you taught me that hope is not weakness. It is not vulnerability. It is the bravest thing a soul can do, to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday, despite all evidence to the contrary." Sebastian had abandoned his gardening and was watching them from across the conservatory, a small smile on his face. He was a perceptive child, Viktor thought. He understood things that couldn't be explained. Clara reached out and took Viktor's hand, cold flesh against warm, immortal against mortal, ancient against fleeting. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "This is where I belong. This is where I've always belonged. I just didn't know it until I walked through that fog." Viktor lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture from another age, courtly and reverent, and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. "Then stay," he said. "Stay, and let us see what eternity looks like when it's no longer spent alone." The sun set fully beyond the hills, and the first stars appeared in a sky the color of bruised violets. Sebastian bounded over to join them, wriggling between their bodies until he was nestled between them, the vampire king, the mortal healer, the impossible child who was proof that love transcends every boundary the universe can devise. "The moonflowers are opening," Sebastian announced. "Can we stay and watch?" "We can stay as long as you like," Viktor said. "We have all the time in the world." They stood together in the gathering dark, watching white flowers unfurl their petals to the rising moon. And if the ghosts of the manor, 3 centuries of loneliness, of loss, of solitary grief, watched from the shadows, they watched with something like peace, something like blessing, something like the understanding that even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn. 100 doctors had failed the vampire king's son. A poor waitress had healed him overnight, not with medicine, not with magic, not with any power that could be measured or quantified or explained, just with the simplest, oldest, most powerful force in the universe: love. And in the manor on the hill, where shadows had reigned for 300 years, a new story was beginning, written not in blood or darkness, but in laughter and warmth and the quiet miracle of belonging. A story that would continue, night after night, year after year, for as long as moonflowers bloomed and stars wheeled overhead, and a vampire king remembered what it meant to hope, for as long as love proved stronger than darkness, which is to say, forever.